The ontological argument concerned with being is an a priori argument, first proposed by Saint Anselm in his book Proslogion. The argument attempts to prove God's existence by definition. Anselm's ontological argument. First form. Anselm began by defining God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, TTWNGCBC. We can all comprehend in our minds a being which is ultimately perfect. However, we can also conceive of a greater being that exists both in the mind and in reality. This being then would be greater than God. Thus, if God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, then he must exist in reality as well as in the mind. Second form. Anselm developed his argument by proposing that it is impossible to conceive of a God not existing. God is a necessary being, he cannot not be. If God were a contingent being, one whose existence depends on something else, he would not be the greatest since we could image him not existing. Thus, a necessary being is greater than a contingent one. If God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, then he must be a necessary being, i.e. in existence. Rene Descartes' ontological argument. He starts by stating that God is a supremely perfect being, i.e. possesses all perfections. Existence is a perfection, therefore God exists. He used a triangle to prove his point. A triangle has necessary characteristics, a predicate, such as internal angles which add up to 180 degrees. If any of these predicates are removed, the triangle is no longer a triangle. Similarly, existence is a necessary predicate of God.
General advantages of ontological argument. There is no need for empirical evidence to prove God's existence. A strength of an a priori argument is that if you accept the premise, then the conclusion must be true as it is logically necessary. God must, by definition, exist. To accept on the one hand that God is that than which no greater can be conceived, and then to say that God doesn't exist, is to make a logical error. The argument is intellectually stimulating and logically satisfying. It forces the believer to consider carefully what they mean by the term God. Plantinga, he starts his argument with a scientific hypothesis and so avoids the immediate problems associated with existence as a predicate and the rejection of the definition. Is he only delaying it? If the multiverse theory is proved correct, then Plantinga's argument becomes mathematically and logically sound. General disadvantages of ontological argument. Limitation of an a priori argument is that if one premise is shown to be inaccurate, the whole argument falls to pieces. Kant, we can simply reject the definition. Kant, existence is not a predicate. If we add or take away existence from something, it does not change the definition. You cannot define God into existence. Russell, you cannot say existence is predicate, otherwise you could say this: 1. Men exist. 2. Father Christmas is a man. 3. Therefore Father Christmas exists. This is syllogism. Russell, Anselm makes the ontological argument into an intension when really it is only an extension. Davis, accuses Anselm of turning an existences into a defining is conflation. Hume, necessary existence is not a coherent concept, as existence can only be contingent. God's characteristics are contradictory. For example, an omnipotent God could create a stone he couldn't lift. If the multiverse theory is proved wrong, then the whole argument falls apart. If there are an infinite number of worlds with an infinite number of possibilities, then there must be a world in which no God exists. The multiverse theory only says there is more than one universe, not an infinite number, and thus not an infinite number of possibilities. Gaunilo was a monk alive at Anselm's time. He used the analogy of the perfect island in his book On Behalf of the Fool to illustrate the absurdity of the first form of the ontological argument. He said that if you imagine the most perfect island, then since it is perfect and existence is part of perfection, then it must necessarily exist. Otherwise, the grottiest island would be better than the imaginary perfect island. Anselm's counter-argument to this was that he was not arguing about contingent things such as islands, but of that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Islands have no intrinsic maximum. They can always be bettered, since according to John Hick, notions of perfection are subjective. God is not temporal or contingent, and thus his existence is necessary. Anselm formulated the second form to counter-argue this specific criticism. Immanuel Kant argued against Descartes' form of the ontological argument. He says that existence is not a predicate. This is because to say that something exists makes no difference to the definition of the thing. Just because you add "and exists" to the end of the word bachelor, does not change its definition. Evaluation. Anselm's starting point was belief in God, and thus it is not fair to criticize it as objective proof. For Anselm it was more of a meditation on his already existing faith than an attempt to prove God's existence to the atheist. Anti-realism, statements are not objectively true but subjectively true within the religious community. Wittgenstein's idea of language games. The argument makes sense within the religious community. In the end, the argument must be analytically sound, and in this case this is only so if the premise is universally accepted. If we reject the definition, then the argument fails. Thus, the argument cannot work as objective proof.
Thank you for watching. If you want this channel to upload more video on A-level religious studies, please like this video and subscribe this channel.